Okay. 1, 2, 1, 2. Is the mic on? Can you hear me? All right. Okay, so on the topic of dreams, last night I had a dream in which we all went to Amazon. I'm not talking about a website and shopping for books. I'm talking about the world's largest rainforest. It's an area in South America, which is roughly the size of the continental United States. And the Amazon is the driver of weather systems around the Western Hemisphere. It's the creator of water and air. And it's also a moderator of our climate as a major sink for carbon. The Amazon is also known for being a global biodiversity hotspot. And as you can see in this exquisite image that was created by North Carolina State University researchers, in particular Clinton Jenkins, which overlaps amphibian, mammal, and bird biodiversity. You can see the role that the Amazon plays. And in particular, I would draw your attention to the western Amazon, where the Andes come down, which is sort of off the charts in terms of biodiversity. Another way of looking at that is a map designed by colleague Dr. Matt Feiner, which adds to that biodiversity plant diversity. And the red area is what he calls the area of quadruple richness center in the Ecuadorian Amazon and in the northwestern Peruvian Amazon. Now, biodiversity very often tracks with cultural diversity. And these are areas that have been home to indigenous groups for many years. Different groups like the Quechua, like the Waorani, like the Zapara, including indigenous peoples' uncontacted groups like the Taromenane. Some colleagues have referred to this area of the northwestern Amazon as the sacred headwaters of the Amazon River. And implicit in this term sacred is the spiritual and cultural historical value that these areas have had for indigenous peoples for time immemorial. One of those groups that I would like to introduce you today and that I have had the tremendous honor and pleasure of accompanying over the course of the last 6 years are the Ashwar. Are you ready? Now, the Ashwar territory, like many parts of the Amazon, is very remote. So in order to get there, we have to take a boat or a plane. And since the clock is ticking, I think we'll fly today. As we fly in to the horizon, we see what people refer to as the Emerald Sea. Some people might think of this as pristine or as wilderness. But in fact, this is an area that has been touched by humans for a long time, just in a very sustainable way. The occasion of our visit to Ashwar territory is an annual assembly. Members from dozens of communities are elected and they come in by boat or by walking several days through well-maintained path system through Ashwar territory in a demonstration of the collective decision-making process that the Ashwar have used for a long time. So here we are landing, and the welcome party is very excited to see us all arriving. Let me introduce you to some of our Ashwar friends. On the left, we have Payas Payas, who's the leader of the Ashwar Federation. And over on the right is Puwanch, an emerging woman leader. We'll be seeing them again later. The assembly itself is built around a very fundamental concept for the Ashwar, which is called their life plan. The life plan is essentially a grassroots, holistic blueprint for how the Ashwar want to develop themselves. And it includes very important elements like bilingual education. Here we have some Ashwar high school students. Intercultural medicine, essentially the best of both worlds, the Ashwar's ancestral medicinal technologies with modern technology, and also locally appropriate development projects. So here we are at the assembly, and you get a sense of the participants. Now, one project which is discussed at this assembly is a project that the Ashwar had been working on for several years, in which they mapped out their own territory. And it was this extraordinary process of, very similar to the map that we saw from South Sudan, I believe, of people sitting down and drawing out all of the areas, the historic settlements and hunting grounds and migration patterns, the sacred sites of the Ashwar, and also the cemeteries. And so they map that out, and then they meticulously go to all of those sites over several years with GPS, using modern technology to map out their territory. And so what you end up with, and you can see what would be the Achuar, what they call integral territory, along with a series of other neighboring indigenous peoples. Now, unfortunately, in Peru, the land titling laws are very retrograde and only allow for community by community title. They don't allow for this kind of collective titling. But the Achuar have mapped out their territory, and they're using that as a tool to push for that. So this is an important discussion that we have during the assembly. While we're there, we're also partaking in different sort of traditions and very specific aspects of Achuar culture. We're enjoying this sort of pungent masato, which is a fermented yucca drink, which I'd say is mildly alcoholic, maybe about 5 proof. We're also eating the local fare. For example, the Achuar hunt, essentially it's kind of like a jungle rodent of unusual size called a mahas, and they hunt it at night. And I can attest that the sort of forearm of the mahas is a particularly tender and delicious delicacy. Very importantly, we also participate in the daily ritual of the Wayusa, which is Achuar families get up at 3 in the morning and they prepare this highly caffeinated tea. And then over the course of several hours, they drink the Wayusa, they have lots of conversations, and then when they're wired, essentially, they actually vomit up the water, having absorbed the caffeine, and then they shoot off to their daily tasks at the break of dawn. But this is a very important time, actually. And we mentioned the dreams for the Achuar. The dream world is very important, and it's the space in which Achuar elders and their ancestors speak and communicate with them. And so there's this kind of moment between the dream world and the day, the hour of the Wayusa, which is very significant. It's also a time when a lot of important conversations happen. And as their guests, we get up, and that's one time that we have to really get to know our Achuar hosts. Back in the assembly, another key aspect of the life plan is what the Achuar call territorial defense. And it's important to note that along with all of the tremendous riches of Achuar territory, they're also sitting on oil. So for the last 20 years, the Peruvian government has been encouraging oil companies to go in and to prospect with an eye towards exploiting the oil resources. The Achuar, because of their firm belief in territorial defense, have resisted this. And so during the assembly, our friend Puanch relates back, she's reporting back to the assembly about advocacy efforts and an international delegation that the Achuar went on in which she participated. To go to Canada and to convince Talisman Energy that Achuar territory was not the place to go. So she recounts stories of visits in Ottawa to the Canadian Parliament and recruiting members of Parliament to speak out on behalf of the Achuar. She recounts stories of going to Calgary and to the annual shareholder meeting of Talisman, doing media work, doing a protest outside, and then going into the shareholder meeting. And she recounts stories of advocacy efforts here in Washington, D.C., in fact, at the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. And there's a brief moment of celebration when the Achuar reflect on the fact that Talisman last year, in September of 2012, announced that they were leaving Achuar territory. But that feeling of celebration is very short-lived. We discussed the fact that just weeks before the assembly, information became public that the Peruvian government had shifted that concession from an international oil company, Talisman, and had turned it over to Petroperu, the state-owned oil company. So the Achuar, once again, in a demonstration of their ongoing resistance, they organize, they take to the streets, as it were, actually the landing strip in the middle of this community, and they protest. And then with the hope that we as international allies will document and will help take this message and their will out to the world. And at the end of the rally, Payas offers a rousing talk explaining that for the Achuar, territory is life, and they will continue to defend that. They also express their appreciation for us having come as allies, and they give us some mementos for as we depart, including some of these items, which are made in the colors of the Ashwar flag, each one representative of different key concepts: the blue for the sky, the green for the forest itself, and actually, as the Ashwar are a warrior tribe, the red representing the blood of their forefathers who fought for their children. Sort of stepping back from this very particular example of local resistance, I guess local action, the second part of our theme this morning, I want to talk a little bit about some of the global threats that the Amazon is facing. And each of these topics could very well be a subject of an entire 18-minute talk. So you'll excuse me if I kind of go through these in a very quick manner. Environmental groups like to talk about drivers of deforestation. So let's look at some of those. I've categorized them in different, because there are many, I've categorized them into different areas. The first area are sort of illegal drivers of deforestation. And so we have things like coca production, especially in the Andes, and also the fumigation efforts to try to counter those. We have the question of illegal logging. And you might have seen on the front page of the New York Times last month, there was an article about corruption in the logging sector in Peru, based on some fantastic investigations that colleagues at Environmental Investigation Agency have carried out. And essentially, the shocking statistic is that roughly 80% of timber products that are leaving Peru are illegally sourced. And then also we've talked about here earlier the issue of gold mining. This is a photo from the southern province of Madre de Dios, where gold mining has exploded 400% since 1999, roughly tracking the meteoric rise in the price of gold, which it basically went up sixfold between 1999 and 2011. Prices come down a little bit, but it's still huge. And you heard, of course, about some of the impacts of the gold mining. Some colleagues would say that these are simply manifestations of bigger drivers of deforestation, which is actually consumer economies. And we're the ones who buy the gold. We're the ones who put in hardwood flooring in our houses. And some of us, maybe there's someone in here, are the ones who are taking cocaine. I guess nobody in this room, but certainly within our society. So those are some of the illegal ones, and those are ones that governments love to talk about, and they love to hammer on them. But there are also a whole series of officially sanctioned drivers, which are very much caught up in the development plans of governments across the region. And whether we're talking about nominally right-wing governments or left-wing, it doesn't matter. They're moving forward. We have dam construction. This is a photo from the Belamonte Dam, and there are dozens of dams planned throughout the Amazon. Of course, we have roads that are slicing through the Amazon, intercontinental roads that are moving from Brazil through Peru and other areas. And you might be familiar with the fishbone pattern from the satellite. The road construction very much facilitates many of the other forms, the other drivers of deforestation, the illegal logging, the mining, et cetera. There's also the expansion of the agricultural frontier, and that has a number of manifestations. These are very recent photos that were taken in Tamchiacu, outside of Iquitos in northern Peru. And these are areas that are being deforested for African palm plantations. And of course, within the agricultural frontier, we also have soy production and, of course, cattle, which is has enormous effect on the Brazilian Amazon. Of course, in addition to that, climate change itself is becoming a driver of deforestation. And there are very strong concerns that essentially the Amazon is at the precipice of a tipping point, after which the entire ecosystem will move into inexorable dieback and will essentially become a savanna. And so we have this process in which deforestation affects water, affects rainfall patterns, essentially extending the dry season, drying out the forest, making it more vulnerable to fires. And here's a quick, there are different scenarios, there are different things that are playing themselves out, and scientists are trying to predict this. And this is one map sort of looking at what deforestation might look like around the year of 2030. And the yellow areas are essentially the deforestation. The brown areas are areas that have been logged and so degraded, which also has a tremendous impact. And this idea of the tipping point is not just the sort of ravings of some activist, but in fact, respected scientists are tremendously concerned about this happening. Have we hit the tipping point? We don't know. And it's actually possible that we have. But it underscores the urgency of focusing on these issues. Really quickly, because my time is running out, the Ashwar are not the only case of indigenous peoples who are resisting. This is actually happening all across the Amazon. I just wanted to bring up 2 quick case studies. Very briefly, the Quichua from Sariaco in Ecuador is a fantastic case study, very inspirational, incredibly savvy people who are leveraging technology and international, transnational advocacy networks in the service of their culture and defending their territory and protecting their rights. They took their case to the Inter-American Court in Costa Rica several years ago and won a landmark legal case on behalf of their own rights. They're organized tremendously well at a local level. And I would be remiss to mention that they partnered with Amnesty International to make a fantastic documentary called Children of the Jaguar, which last year in September on this very stage won the National Geographic All Roads Film Festival Best Documentary Award. And there's Eddie Berto here on a panel discussion. That's on the Ecuadorian side. Also in Brazil, many of you are familiar with the Kayapo and other indigenous peoples that have struggled. Chief Hauni here in the center, friend of Sting. And they've resisted dam construction for decades, the Belo Monte Dam and many others. They've been joined by other indigenous peoples, the Arara, the Juruna, who are directly affected by the dam construction, in addition to other kinds of civil society allies, national and international. And my point is that the spirit of resistance is still very strong. It's a spirit that dates back more than 500 years, and I assume and hope that it will be around for another 500 years. Quick case study, returning right back to Peru. I was asked by the organizers to comment on a particular tool or discussion around climate change. If you are involved in the climate discussion and forestry discussions, you might be familiar with the concept of REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. A lot of organizations have been very supportive. I personally am a bit of a REDD skeptic, and it's worth mentioning that a number of indigenous groups and social movements around the region have rejected REDD for various reasons. That said, one of our key indigenous allies in Peru, IDACEP, the largest indigenous federation and most internationally respected, has engaged in the REDD process, in part because Peru, having the 4th largest extension of tropical rainforests in the world, has been designated a REDD pilot country. Now, it's interesting to note that the indigenous peoples they talk about indigenous REDD, but they have another term for this, which is holistic territorial management. And I personally like very much to think about their proposals as holistic territorial management, as opposed to simply focused on reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. IDACEP has been very savvy. They've partnered with international organizations like Forest Peoples Program to analyze their situation and to analyze the threats that REDD poses to rights and territories, but then also to come up with proposals. And they devised this indigenous REDD proposal, and they've brought it to successive meetings, first of the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, and then in recent years, the Forest Investment Program. And in fact, 2 weeks ago today, the Forest Investment Program met, and after years of advocacy on the part of IDACEP and their allies, they approved a forest investment plan, $55 million, roughly $20 million of which goes towards indigenous Amazonian REDD. And so assuming that that can actually be implemented, that will be a huge victory for them. Really quickly, some of the elements of that indigenous REDD. Specifically, what does the money go towards? 1, land titling. 13 million hectares in Peru out of 75 million in the Amazon are currently under indigenous title. IDACEP estimates, after having done an exhaustive study, that roughly 20 million hectares are outstanding. Those are communities that haven't been recognized or titles. Those are territorial reserves for uncontacted peoples. And those are integral territories, similar to what the Ashwar have proposed up in the north. 2, support for community-based forestry management. This is key. I'm not an academic, but I've seen that there are emerging papers, peer-reviewed academic papers, which essentially are demonstrating that community-based forestry management is actually more effective than traditional conservation interventions, like creation of natural protected areas. So it needs the support, also capacity building for indigenous organizations. The financial capital is being put towards this. The real question is, will there be the political will to implement this? We'll see. A couple of other sort of characteristics of this indigenous red. One is a necessary change in the legislation in Peru to allow for the collective titling. The indigenous peoples have said they only want this funded through public funds. They're not interested in carbon markets. They're not interested in offsets. Public funds exist. Norway gave $1 billion to Indonesia and $1 billion to Brazil for forestry protection. IDESEP's just asking for a measly $40 million for all the land titling. So the money is out there. Carbon cowboys. You might have heard this term, essentially con men who are coming into this situation. There's a fantastic Atlantic article that recently ran about this, and the subtitle of the article was, "When the product is invisible, the cons are endless." And it focuses on some of these specific carbon cowboys in the Peruvian Amazon. So it's important that the states are also registering red operators and sanctioning people who are operating outside the law. And then finally, the importance of key indigenous rights safeguards, respecting indigenous autonomy and decision-making, and respecting the right to free, prior, and informed consent, whether or not communities actually want to participate in this or not. So I'd say I see my time is wrapping up. But returning briefly to the Achuar, for their territories and for the Amazon, the Achuar have dreamt about their life plan being brought into effect. They've dreamt about their integral territory and defending it against the incursion of multinational corporations and others. I myself, when I was in Achuar territory, I had a dream, and I dreamt of my daughter, who's 1 year old now. I dreamt of bringing her to Achuar territory in 20 years, and her having the opportunity to meet the Achuar and to learn from them and to experience the splendor of their environment as I have experienced it. And so I would ask you, thinking about the indigenous defenders of the environment, not just in the Amazon and elsewhere, what is your dream? Thank you very much.